Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Brett Perlman, President and CEO of the Center for Houston's Future, and welcome to today's webcast. For those of you who don't know us, the Center is a nonprofit established in the year 2000, and this year is our 20th anniversary. We work to convene business, government, and community stakeholders in fact-based strategic planning and collaboration on issues of the greatest importance to the future of the Houston region. And we're currently focused on three issues: the energy transition, healthcare, and immigration, as well as our Business and Civic Leadership Forum, which is now in its 20th year. We just had a great conclusion to our Fall Leadership Forum, and if you're interested in being part of our Spring Leadership Forum, let us know. Information is available on our website, or you can contact me after the program. Last year, we published a report on immigration called Houston's Economic Future Immigration, which we unveiled at the Baker Institute. We've been collaborating on immigration with the Center for Mexico and the United States at the Rice University's Baker Institute, with the documentary production company Rational Middle, and with New American Economy. And in fact, today's webcast, How to Talk About Immigration and Still Be Talking Afterwards, was suggested by one of our partners, Chelsie Kramer at New American Economy, and is based on some work that they're doing with chambers of commerce. And so we'll kick off today's discussion with a brief video from Rational Middle Media called Coming to America, a brief summary from Chelsie of what NAE has learned from its conversations with the business community, and then our panel discussion. I think it'll be an interesting hour and 20 minutes. And so thank you very much for spending time with us. And on to the video.
It is definitely not easy to become a lawful permanent resident of the United States. As we call it, get a green card. The Supreme Court has said that next to the tax code, immigration law is the second most complex area of law that exists. So we basically say that there's four big categories of permanent immigration to the United States: family reunification, employment-based visas, refugees and asylees, and the diversity lottery program. The main way that individuals permanently immigrate to the United States is through what we call the family reunification program. The first step for family reunification is the family petition. That's a certain form where a lawful permanent resident or a U.S. citizen says, I want this particular family member to immigrate to the United States.
Not just any family member can sponsor you. You have to be related to them in one of specific ways.
It's your spouse, kids, parents, brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens. That's about as far away as you can get in terms of distant relatives.
This is what is being referred to today as chain migration. It's true that you may request a green card for family members, but there's priorities. Spouses have priority, children have priority, but all the other relatives have to be placed in a queue. And then each country receives a number of visas that is capped.
That wait can range from a couple of years to 20 to 25 years, depending on which category you're in and which country you're from.
Relatives also have to submit an affidavit of support indemnifying the federal and state governments against means-tested benefits.
Generally, if you're an immediate relative, that spouse and minor kid of a U.S. person, the line's going to be shorter and faster. And as you get to parents and adult children and brothers and sisters, the lines grow longer.
Although 2/3 of individuals who immigrate to the United States permanently come through the family reunification program, there's also employment-based visas.
High-skilled immigration is possible if you've got a college degree, maybe a master's degree in engineering, science, very specialized areas. You're gonna have to have an employer who offers you a job, puts that job out on the market to find out if there's any other U.S. workers available. It can take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years for that petition to be available.
If they can secure an employer who is willing to sponsor them for a visa, then they are permitted to apply for that, which is a non-immigrant visa. It can eventually turn into a green card, but it certainly is not permanent status at first. After you've applied, there's no guarantee that you're going to receive it.
There's a cap that Congress put on those of basically 85,000. 265,000 applications came in, and they do a lottery for this. You go through all the trouble of filing this application, 85,000 lucky people get these approved, and some win the lottery and still get them denied.
So lots and lots of things stand in the way between somebody who wants to come here to work or an employer that needs a worker and a legal pathway to do it.
Once their visa becomes available, then they apply for their permanent residency or green card. And at that point, that is where your background, your criminal history, your immigration history are all evaluated to find out if you are admissible or if you trigger grounds of inadmissibility, which are reasons inside the law for excluding an individual. To be able to breathe the air in the United States as a lawful permanent resident, you have to do a medical exam that includes blood tests, an exam of tattoos on your body, a mental health assessment, an assessment of whether you've ever been an alcohol or drug abuser, in addition to a test to find out if you have any diseases. They submit their mother and father's names, date of birth, place of birth, country of residence. They talk about your siblings, your work history, your height, your weight, every little thing about you. And then all of that information is submitted to Department of Homeland Security, who has all of the resources to vet that information and check you against databases all over the world. The process of doing a background check just to come over as a refugee could take 3 years, easy.
The point here is that to enter the country legally is one of limited opportunity. To go through the multiple steps necessary to pay the fees to get to legal permanent residence is incredibly difficult.
Our law sets out to try to allow lots of ways for people to come in, but in reality, it's fairly restrictive. And because of these long backlogs and waits, even if there's a line you theoretically can get into, how many people are going to wait 20 or 30 years for a visa? If you're in really desperate straits, that's not really a viable means for you to try to come in.
And for many people, many workers who want to come to the United States to do particularly less skilled labor, the thing that we really have the greatest demand in our economy for, there's no line to get in. There is no temporary worker program for less skilled workers who are working in the year-round economy. But if you're working day in and day out all year long as an employer and you need the immigration system to give you a foreign-born worker, the answer from the immigration system is no.
You just take the average person in the world that wants to immigrate to the U.S. It's impossible. One, they don't have the close family relationship. Or two, there's no way they can create a relationship with an employer that's willing to sponsor them in a position for which there's a shortage of U.S. workers.
Sometimes you hear people saying, oh, get in line like everybody else. Well, they don't realize that for them there is no line. The way I think about it is, if you look at the Statue of Liberty, where it says, give me you're tired and you're poor and you're huddled masses and all, it should say, give me your relatives and then give me your engineers and your scientists. And the poor people, they have no path to come into this country.
To your everyday American, it doesn't make sense. But I guess the law is not meant to make sense. The law is just meant to restrict who comes to the United States.
Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that amazing film by Rational Middle. They're excellent partners. And in addition to that film, there are several on their website. So if you have a chance and you're interested about specific topics, you can definitely find them there. For those of you who don't know, my name is Chelsie Kramer. I am based in Houston, and I am the state organizer for New American Economy, or NAE. We are a bipartisan research and advocacy organization. We fight for smart federal, state, and local immigration policies that are really focused on helping grow our economy and creating jobs for all Americans. Our bread and butter is using original research to demonstrate how immigration impacts our economy, whether that's at the very local level, within your county or your city, or even nationally. You can find our detailed reports like our immigration and COVID-19 portal at newamericaneconomy.org and our business coalition at txcompact.org. I'll end up sharing those links in the chat after I'm done here. So before I give y'all some really fast facts on immigration in Texas to kind of tee up this amazing panel that we have, I want to quickly share a personal story. So like Brett alluded to earlier this year, I was at a small family birthday party for my 4-year-old nephew. And in between talking about dinosaurs and Paw Patrol, the conversation somehow turned to immigration. And I think it was stemming from maybe a news headline about family separation or something along those lines. And I did keep quiet for most of the conversation and just really listened. And really what happened was I was astonished to learn that my educated family of avid voters who all believe that they are very well informed knew almost nothing about the immigration system. And mind you, I've worked in this space for over 2 years now. So, and then also my mother-in-law's parents immigrated from Germany as children. So there's really, it's really not that far off from them. And yet they thought they knew about it and they really didn't. At the end of the conversation, I interjected and briefly explained just that immigrating to the United States is much more complicated than it seems, as you just saw from the Rational Middle video. And everyone was stunned and ended up agreeing that we do need a better system. And we agreed on lots of different points. Now, at this point, I should mention that my own father owns a MAGA hat, and he also does wear this. So this is a group of people that I'm spending time with that are typically hard R voters and are in rural parts of Texas or come from very conservative backgrounds. And so I was reflecting back on that conversation and wish that there were more tools to help regular folks who are outside of this advocacy bubble that I live in discuss immigration without it turning into a heated debate. Because watching my family, you just saw the temperatures rise on everyone. And I'm sure many of you have been in the same situations. And a lot of times that ends up with us not wanting to talk about these conversations again in the future. So I pitched the idea to the Center for Houston's Future. And so here we are. So on to some really quick facts. I have 2 slides that will give you some visual aid about what I'm going to be talking about. And then we'll also end up sharing a guide that covers them all as well. In Texas, immigrants make up more than 17% of our population. They pay more than $38 billion in federal, state, and local taxes annually. And amazingly, they hold a spending power of over $113 billion. And again, this is just Texas. These are just Texas immigrants. Additionally, Texas immigrants make up more than a quarter of our STEM workers and healthcare workers. And as we know, right now, that is more important than ever. I should also mention that this data comes from government sources, and it's very clear that immigrants are huge economic drivers, especially here in Texas. Yet, in my travels across Texas, I run into a lot of folks, whether that's chambers of commerce, business organizations, or whatever it is, who are very, very timid about talking openly about immigration. And then I always end up, when we finally do get to the starting a conversation, the same questions always keep arising, which are, why can't these quote unquote illegal immigrants get in line? Why do some people use the term illegal and others use undocumented? Aren't they taking our jobs? And I get that one even more frequently now in 2020. And then also, what about law and order? Now, these are questions that I know our panel is going to definitely cover and touch on in multiple ways. And if you're really, and I also want to mention, if you're interested in how immigrants are affecting your community, whether that's in your county, congressional district, major metro, or just across the country, be sure to visit maptheimpact.org, and you can find all these different kinds of stats. It's a really simple website, and it all is using government data as well. So back to while facts and figures can be a great vehicle to begin a conversation around immigration, what we found is certainly not the only way to help average folks connect with the issue, especially since what we keep hearing from those in DC, they tend to frame the discussion as a Democrat versus a Republican conversation, when that is absolutely not the truth at all. What I found is we have folks that are literally giant donors for Republicans and big donors for Democrats working together on this issue and having a lot of the same values and agreeing on a lot of things. So finally, as as you listen to the panel's conversation, I hope you take away several new tools and remember, most importantly, that when you are having these tough conversations at your Thanksgiving dinner table or your virtual happy hour, remember to frame it not as a debate or a lecture, but remember to frame this as an opportunity for everyone to learn more about their community, their family members, and then what are those shared values you have. Immigration is not an us versus them conversation, no matter who you're talking to. So look for what unites us and really focus your conversation on that. And if you have any questions, you can reach me at Chelsie@newamericaneconomy.org. I'll throw that in the chat as well. And with that, I will hand it over to Brett and let's get to our awesome panel.
Okay. And Elizabeth, you're going to have to let me start my video again if you want me to come back. Start my video. Okay, cool. So now I'm pleased to introduce Laura Collins, who's director at the Bush Institute SMU Growth Initiative, which is at the George W. Bush Institute, which is basically the Bush Library, which is an amazing facility in Dallas if you haven't been there. She was previously the director of immigration policy at American Action Forum, and she has extensive experience both in politics and as a practicing attorney. And we're just so pleased, Laura, that you have agreed to help us out today. And I'll turn it over to you to introduce your panel. Laura, good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited about this panel. As Brett said, I'm Laura Collins. I'm the Director of Economic Growth at the Bush Institute SMU Economic Growth Initiative. You know, at the Bush Institute, if you're not familiar with our work, we believe in developing leaders, fostering policy, and taking action to solve today's most pressing challenges. And the pressing challenge that I work on is immigration reform. And if you've followed our work at all in the past, you know that we really look at this issue, at least in the past, through an economic lens. Why is immigration good for our economy? How does it stimulate growth? Why is it good for us fiscally? But if you've paid attention at all to President Bush's post-presidency, you know that he has other projects in mind. Namely, he's a painter. And so we had a very exciting announcement over the summer. President Bush's next book is going to be called Out of Many One, and it is a book of portraits of immigrants, and it will feature their stories and their backgrounds and really just highlight what are the everyday contributions of people who are just like you and me, normal people, haven't done necessarily anything to make them famous, but they're contributing in their communities just like you and I are. And so as part of that initiative, you'll also see us roll out some new policy recommendations. We're not going to be just talking about why immigration is good for the economy. We're also going to emphasize why it's good for our culture, how it enriches us as Americans, and really talk about what the inherent value of immigrants are, because they're human beings just like you and me. They have inherent value just for existing. And so, you know, I know from my everyday life and from my professional life that these are tough conversations. Immigration can be a very heated topic. And so whether you're new to this topic or you're really passionate about it, whether you're on the pro-immigration side or you're skeptical or even very concerned about things like illegal immigration and border security, we hope that today you'll be able to take away some tools for having really good conversations about this topic, especially as the holidays are coming up. We all know there's a mute button on Zoom, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your Thanksgiving conversations have to be, you don't have to just ignore everybody if everyone's having a conversation that you are uncomfortable with. We can have good, productive conversations. One housekeeping issue before we introduce our panel. There is a Q&A function and there is a chat function on here. As you're listening to our panelists, please feel free to drop questions into the chat. I did notice at least one already made it into Q&A. We'll try to address that as it comes up. I will be checking the chat regularly to try to mix in audience questions. And so make sure you drop them in there and we'll keep an eye on that and try to get to as many questions as possible. And so I would love to now introduce our panel. We have today with us three amazing individuals. Zaira Garcia is the Texas State Director for Forward.us, a bipartisan political organization that believes America's families, communities, and economy thrive when more individuals are able to achieve their full potential. We also have Candy Marshall with us. Candy Marshall is the president of the Dream.us, the nation's largest college access and success program for dreamers. And for those of you who are new to this topic, dreamers are undocumented immigrants who were brought to the US by their parents when they were children. We'll talk more about that later, I'm sure. And finally, Dan Vallone. Dan is the director of More in Common USA, an organization whose mission is to understand the forces driving us apart, to find common ground, and help to bring people together to tackle our shared challenges. Thank you all for joining us. I'm actually going to start with Zaira. I want you to tell us a little bit more about the work that Forward does on immigration policy, and also give us a little bit of a flavor of, what are these tough conversations that you have in your professional life and your personal life, and what is it that your perspective is on these as we move into the holiday season?
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm really excited to join today's discussion. As you mentioned, Forward.us is a bipartisan political advocacy group. So we have conversations with members on both sides of the aisle, community members who are both Republican and Democrat, or across that spectrum, right? And so I have the honor of leading our work in the state of Texas. Very proud Texan here, but in my role, I also have the privilege to meet different people from all walks of life. My job is to literally identify and build relationships with key stakeholders across the state of Texas who understand this issue because it either impacts them, their loved ones, members of their community, or their business. And this isn't hard to do, mostly because immigration is one of those issues that really impacts and intersects with almost every corner of our communities and our economy. And what I mean when I say that is that this is an issue that impacts almost everyone. For example, take the education community. If teachers can't teach and help students meet state standardized tests because students are worried about parents getting deported or the immigration issue impacting their family, that will impact their performance, that will ultimately impact the school's funding, right? That hurts everyone across the board. Additionally, a different example, take law enforcement. They cannot identify real public safety threats when witnesses or victims of violence won't come forward for fear of deportation, making all of us less safe. Business leaders who have a labor shortage or lack the talent or the stability to really grow their business due to outdated temporary visa solutions delays economic prosperity for the entire community. The list goes on, right? And so in my job, I'm able to meet these individuals and really learn about their experience. And then on the other part of that, my job is also to build relationships with members on both sides of the aisle, as I mentioned before, really centered on true bipartisanship, and then identifying opportunities to bridge the two so that representatives are hearing from their own constituents about how this issue impacts them and their district. Coordinating this constituent to member advocacy really helps to inform immigration policy initiatives at the federal level. The last thing I'll just say is that I've coordinated in district roundtable meetings with Republicans and Democrats since 2015, so about 5 years now, and I have yet to have a bad experience in having those conversations, mostly because I've always worked to have a diverse set of folks in the room to share how our outdated immigration system impacts everyone, and then through that, the ability to construct conversations centered around their lived experiences allows for fruitful discussions that don't alienate anyone, but instead really seek to identify where that overlap and understanding on the issue is, and then build from there. I really attempt to coach folks to operate from a place of we all want the same things: opportunity, economic prosperity, safety for our families, and that anti-immigrant policies really hurt everyone across the board, not just immigrants. So that was a lot, but I really look forward into talking about how these experiences that I've been able to see in having these difficult conversations about immigration can actually lead to really positive outcomes.
Thank you so much, Zaira. Candy, I'm going to turn to you next, mostly because, one, I love the work that you do, but also because we had an interesting conversation last week where you talked about how you grew up having these difficult conversations because of your family background. So give us a little bit of what you do now and how your childhood informs how you approach this topic.
Okay, so great to be here. Thank you all for including me, and thank you for those of you who are attending. So I have the great opportunity right now to lead a program called the Dream.us. And it is now the nation's largest college access and success program for undocumented immigrant youth. And then the moment I say that it is the nation's largest, I have to add and say it's not that hard to be the largest because there aren't that many people offering scholarships to undocumented immigrant youth. We created this program because undocumented immigrant youth came to the country in two different ways, really. One is they may have crossed the border with their parents but actually didn't go through border control, so no one checked their documents, so they're viewed as being undocumented. The second is they actually came into the country legally with visas, tourist visas, and they simply outstayed those visas. So they find themselves here. They came as young people. The average age of our scholars when they came is 4.5 years old. They've grown up here. They've gone to our elementary schools, our high schools. They are our prom kings and queens. They are football quarterbacks. They are debate champions. They are fully integrated into our communities, and yet they have no path to citizenship. When Obama was in office, he put in place DACA, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with now, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And young people can apply for DACA status. It's a very rigorous screening process. If they get DACA, they are able to be here lawfully. That is, they cannot be deported, and they can get a work authorization, which gives them a social security number. So they're able to legally work. That has been under much attack under the Trump administration. It is still today in place, but no one has been able, no young people graduating from our high schools have been able to apply for it. And just so you have a sense, 98,000 undocumented students graduate from our high schools in America each year. So it's a huge number of students. They cannot access Pell Grants. They cannot get federal loans. They cannot get work study. So we created this program to step in and really serve as a stopgap until Congress actually acts to implement a DREAM Act. It has been an incredible experience working with these students. They are resilient, they are determined, and they simply will not fail. And I talk about them and what they bring to our country. They are entrepreneurial from the moment they step foot on the land in this country, and they have lived with uncertainty from that moment. And because of that, they really do bring a resilience that very much embodies what I think about as the American spirit. We funded students, and we now are funding over 5,000 students in colleges across the United States. These students are rocking it in college. They exceed the national benchmarks for persistence, for graduation, for GPA. They are engaged in their communities on campus. They are the campus leaders. We have one college where it's 67% white student. Undocumented students hold all of the officer positions for the student body government. So a phenomenal group of people. But my background, interesting to be doing this work. I'm a farm girl from Nebraska. I grew up in a family that very much didn't talk about politics. My dad voted Democrat, my mother voted Republican. We often made a joke that they were simply canceling each other's votes out, but not a lot of political discussion to be had at the table. So as you might imagine, having started this work, I was faced with all those questions that Chelsie was talking about. Why would you give scholarships to these students when US students citizens cannot afford to go to college? Aren't they going to take US citizens spots in colleges? Why would you give them those spots? Very competitive. If they're able to work, aren't they going to be taking our jobs? So all of those questions I have had to face, and we'll talk about this more, but I've put to use in my conversations with my family, and now, of course, with others about our program, this mantra. And I learned it back in the 80s when I was the chair of the YMCA here in Seattle. I went to a national conference for the CEOs and chairs of the board. And it had people from the South, very conservative, tend to be much more religious, people from the North and the West Coast, much more liberal, much less religious bent, coming together. And one of the key topics on the table was, should we allow the LGBTQ community into the YMCAs? And a very difficult conversation, as you might imagine, at that point in the country's history. And the person that facilitated it started the conversations with this: let us first seek to understand, and only then to be understood. And so that's what I've tried to bring to conversations, and really going deep with people and about their fears. If they're worried about immigrants taking their jobs. Where does that come from? Asking them questions about it. So I'm really excited to talk more about how we might do that, but that's enough for me for now.
Thank you so much, Candy. So Dan, the work that you do actually has research that underscores some of the things we're talking about. Can you tell us more about the work of More in Common? And also, given the stories that you've already heard, what in your research underscores the techniques and just the trial and error that we've all had and what's effective there?
Yeah, sure. No, I appreciate it. And I really am glad to be here and glad to have this conversation with everyone. So More in Common is a research and civic organization we launched in 2018 precisely to understand what is pulling Americans apart and how can we communicate in ways that actually activate our shared identities and speak to our shared values and beliefs. And so our first major research effort was something called Hidden Tribes, a study of America's polarized landscape. We released that in 2018. And recognizing that we are living in this intensely polarized moment when we really feel very viscerally divided as a country, and where conversations on topics such as immigration, but increasingly across the board, are frozen because we're so hesitant to try and talk about, we're so scared of being judged or having to judge people. So rather than just viewing people as Democrats, Republicans, and independents, we approach our work through the lens of worldview, identity, and values. And so in Hidden Tribes, we segmented the country into 7 distinct categories that looked not at people's demographics or party ID, but rather what kinds of identities and values animate their beliefs in politics and culture. And when we know that, we can better understand how do you communicate to somebody in ways that speaks to their underlying worldview. And that's one of the key first points I'll flag that I think everyone from Chelsie to Zaira and Candy has kind of mentioned. It's when you're talking to someone, you're going to get a lot better reception if you can speak to their underlying worldview. It's not about trying to convince them of your ideology or narrative, but rather understanding that they might come at this issue from a very different set of values and speak in that language, and they're going to be much more receptive. The second major piece of research that we've also done is examining the degree to which we exaggerate our differences. Because we're so polarized, we tend to assign to people that are different from us and different in every possible way, much more extreme positions than they hold. And I'll just point to 2 data points that we produced in a report called Perception Gap that we released in 2019, which Democrats think that only about half of Republicans support properly controlled immigration, when the actual number is much closer to 85%. Republicans think that 62% of Democrats want completely open borders, when in fact only about 29% support that position. So because we just think the other side is so extreme, we're missing this really significant it's ground to have compromised dialogue and conversation. So that's the second point. And then the third thing that we do a lot of research on is actually how do you have these conversations? So we published a website called Democracy for President this year, where there's a discussion guide that's literally called How Do You Talk to Somebody You Disagree With? And we walk through steps that apply to almost any issue about how you can sit down at the table with somebody who has a very different ideological viewpoint from you and walk away from that table still friends or family and be able to have a constructive dialogue. So there are evidence-based methods for doing this. It is hard, it is difficult, but it's also more important than ever that we do this.
That's great. Thank you. Your point about we seem to be talking past each other, right? We have so much in common, but there is, I feel like mostly because I work in this on this issue a lot, there's certain language that tends to get used amongst people who pay attention to the topic a lot or work in the space or just have certain political leanings that might not be language shared by the other side, even if we're talking about the same things. And, Zaira, because you do so much bipartisan work on this, talk to me a little bit. I have 2 questions really. One, what is the importance of using language that's accurate and respectful on the one hand, but also how do you make sure to have a little bit of grace for people who maybe don't understand the topic as well, maybe have less of a connection to people who might be sensitive to the language used, and how do you make sure to balance those competing initiatives?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question, thinking about the language that we use. Many times, I'll give a really quick example of something I did in my own personal capacity, but in 2016, around the presidential election, when we still had a dozen folks running on both sides of the ticket, I went to a town hall for candidate Jeb Bush. And I really just wanted to listen to not only him, what his policy priorities were going to be, but also learn from the folks who are showing up to support him or to learn about him, what their priorities were. And I sat next to this elderly couple. They might have been in their late 60s, early 70s, and just chatted them up a bit to hear kind of why they had shown up to this event and learn, it's always important to learn about folks and what is important to voters. And so they talked about immigration being one of the big things that brought them to the event, and that they really didn't think it was fair, that we needed to follow law and order, and just very anti-immigrant in their language and expression. And I kind of went in and just asked them questions, tried to understand where they were coming from, why they believed what they believed. And it was a lot of different news headlines that they've read with sources that, have certain different motives. And something that I've learned about language is that there is already, experts on both sides of the issue who do this full time, who have defined, as you're saying, talking about the same issue, but either an anti-immigrant type language to it or a pro-immigration type language to it. Something that I do is I just take a complete step back and talk about, from a values perspective, what are we actually talking about here? Unpack that. And so in that conversation with these folks, we really carried out their perspective about deporting everyone. And when we carried that out, being in Texas, we were able to talk about how much of the construction workforce, I believe it's like 60% is the last data point that we have, 60% of the construction industry in Texas is undocumented. Where would our infrastructure be if we deported everyone, right? We talked about DACA recipients, many of them who are teachers educating our children, the future of America in their classroom right now, being living in limbo and potentially being deported if DACA were to be terminated, as Candy talked about. These things, and carrying out really their framework that they've built over time based on all of the information that they've been getting, and realizing that that's actually not at all what they supported. What they supported was a fair system, a just system, and they realized really that everyone is entering this conversation at a different point with different levels of understanding. It's been my experience that when you listen and you're really able to unpack how they've reached their anti-immigrant conclusion, most folks are able to take a step back and realize there's more than the black and white deport them all or open borders framework. And so really, I think for me, my approach is take a break from the politicized language and listen to people and listen to what language are they using, speak to them in a way that really unpacks their perspective, and they're on their own. They're able to reach their own conclusion that they want also a fair and just immigration system.
That's great. And that really kind of ties back to Candy's point earlier about meeting people where they are and understanding their perspective. And one of the things I find interesting about the work that Candy does is that you're meeting a reality, right? What you're working on is there is this problem, and unless there is broader immigration reform, it's not going to get fixed. But you're trying to meet the reality of the problem, and which is that undocumented immigrant children are not going to have the opportunity to go to college without scholarships because there's just barriers there. So that's, I think, your work parallels these conversations nicely. Can you talk to us a little bit about where you find resistance and your personal life, or in your professional life rather, and helping people understand that you're just meeting a reality of our policy failures rather than trying to really stick it to other people, because it does become a little bit of a win-loss. How do you help people understand that this is not about beating one group in favor of another?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So one, back to Dan's point, 85% of Americans, and this is a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans, believe that people with DACA should have the ability to stay and work in the country. And so surprisingly, there's not as much resistance to what we do as you might think. But what I did discover early on, and I so appreciated this pushback, when I would get calls from people expressing concern about our program. One, they were concerned that we were using federal dollars to support undocumented students, which of course we were not, and you actually could not do. It is all privately funded. And by the way, very much has the support of Republicans and Democrats. Carlos Gutierrez, a former Secretary of Commerce under Bush, was one of the founders of our program. When we launched it, Jeb Bush, Newt Gingrich, Grover Norquist, all endorsed our program because they thought it was so important to support these students. So I would get pushback from middle-class moms in America, and they may have income that really does not allow their child to get the Pell Grant. And college, as we know, is shamefully expensive. And in those conversations, the first thing I had to do was express empathy. I hear you. I can see how difficult it is. We actually have one of our major founders and co-funders who, along with giving scholarships to undocumented students, also gives scholarships to US citizens, because he recognized we need to acknowledge it's not just hard for undocumented students, it's hard for middle-class Americans. So lots of empathy in those conversations. Similarly, the concern about, well, if your dreamer gets in, they're going to take the spot of my kid. Well, first of all, it's a much easier argument to address in today's world because college enrollment is down pretty much across the board, both public and private. So what we've discovered is that the colleges completely welcome our scholars because they come with a scholarship that is going to help pay for the expenses of the institution. And our scholarship actually provides more than the Pell Grant. So for colleges, it's actually better to have our scholars because it really does contribute to the economic circumstances of the institution. So it's easier to have that conversation now. With graduates, and we now have 1,500 graduates, we're now starting to have the conversation about, well, aren't your students going to take our jobs? And that's a conversation where I really try to talk with people about, tell me about that. Why do you think that is going to happen? Have you seen something like that? What have you heard? And coming back, Zyra, you just had such good data. I talk with people about the number of teachers who have DACA and how critical they are, the number of healthcare workers who have DACA that are working the front line. And then people seem to calm down in that conversation and realize, well, maybe there are enough jobs for all of us. So that's how I've thought about having those conversations.
That's excellent. Thank you. I'm going to thank you to the audience for starting to submit questions. I'm going to go to some of these questions, and I'm going to just, Dan, a heads up that I'm going to kick this one to you. So the first question, I'm going to read part of it. It says, while I understand the need to be politically correct in these conversations, I can't help but reject the view that we are not incensed and offended by the fact that children are in detention facilities. Polite and informed views are not persuasive, nor should they be tolerated. So the first thing I want to say to this is, and I think that Dan will have some interesting data to talk about, where we actually fall in this and how to deal with this. It's absolutely okay to be really angry about things like that, right? It's one thing to talk about the nuance of skills-based immigration versus family reunification. It's another thing to talk about things that really offend us on a moral or ethical level. And family separation, I think, is one of those topics that really does. And it's okay to really feel angry about that. What I will say from my personal experience, I grew up in a very deeply Republican family, but we really very much understood our own immigration story. My great-grandparents came through Ellis Island. They're from Romania. They had very little formal education. They're the type of immigrants that, based on the video, you wouldn't really see a lot of people like them admitted to the US anymore. And so while my family very deeply appreciates and loves and is proud of our immigration story, I do have family members who are very skeptical about what immigration looks like today and who have concerns about border security and illegal immigration. And I will say, but in my experience, even the people who are most ardently against expanding immigration, whether they're in my professional life or my personal life, very few defend family separation unless they're on Twitter, right? So people who are in your everyday life probably are less polarized about this. And Dan, I think your research, what does your research say about that sort of polarization and how you deal with a topic like that when it's so offensive to so many people?
Yeah, no, it's a great point and question, and I would just echo what you said, Laura, about it's okay to feel angry, it's okay to feel, and it's okay to act on that as well. Just two quick points. So the first is the degree to which we assign that viewpoint to what size population. So if you're going on social media, you are getting a dramatically inaccurate sense. So I think Pew did some research on this, and then we also did some research on it, but it's something like politically active individuals post 10 times more often on social media about political content, or they're just disproportionately much more likely. So that viewpoint, while amplified very loudly through social media, does not represent a significantly large enough population. So we keep that in mind in terms of how we're thinking of our communication strategy overall. The second thing is when we do get into these like very immoral and kind of just unacceptable positions, such as family separation or child detention, the communications we want to use are actually, we still want to try and add complexity to how we communicate. And so what happens is we tend to retreat into our side's language, because that's where we can find a uniform voice. When we want to persuade folks, we actually want to add multiple value statements into how we communicate. And so it's not just an infringement on basic human rights, it's also a compromise of our essential duty as Americans. So we're emphasizing both loyalty, which is kind of a conservative value, and rights and fairness, which is a very powerful liberal value. And that formulation of language is much more effective than just relying on a kind of singular value statement. And the other part that we want to do is we want to emphasize a strong we identity. So like as Texans, it is unacceptable that. That's a much more powerful formulation than just trying to stick to a policy argument, which again doesn't resonate with folks the same way as when you prime their identity as Texans or Houstonians, and then make a strong values assertion about what we stand for and why.
Sarah, I think you had a comment on this as well.
Yeah, I would love to add, because I think it's a very valid point that Michael Trevino made on the chat. It's, for me, I'll take a stab at this, because I come from a community where I am surrounded by mixed status families. I see the hard work of undocumented immigrants day in and day out, and the fear that that puts on their US born children. And no family should have to live with that. And so not only am I a part of this community and have to go into conversations with folks who are not with us on this issue, might be a lot more anti-immigrant, but I'll also share that in terms of, for example, family separation. Forward.us was part of a Flights for Families initiative. I literally, like within a moment's notice, dropped my things when families who were separated at the border were going to be reunited, got on a flight to one of the sites to help take in some of those families and support them through the reunification process. And I cannot tell you the amount of trauma that I visually saw and experienced in seeing families, moms who had children who couldn't even speak, who were not verbal yet, had been separated from their children for weeks, months, I think some. And having to go back to my, political conversations around this issue. And so you keep all of these experiences. I know that I do, for example, know what this does to families, know what this does to American families, know what this does to immigrants. I saw family separation firsthand, and the aftermath of that. And then, we wrapped up some of that work with family separation. And next week, there was a bill that was introduced in Congress that not only limited legal immigration and blocked any pro-immigration initiatives that would have given folks relief, but it also did away with certain categories, which from the Rational Middle video that we saw, the categories that exist are already extremely limited. And so this bill went so far as to completely do away with the already outdated immigration system we have. And so there was a certain Texas Republican who had signed on to this bill to co-sponsor, and I couldn't understand why. And so we went in to coordinate a roundtable discussion with constituents in his district who were impacted by immigration. We had somebody who was a high-skilled immigrant who was here on a temporary visa. We had somebody who was undocumented, somebody who was a DACA recipient. Again, back to diversity in the room, talked to this member, and I really took them in just to make sure that what we were going in was with anecdotes and real, data and facts. And we spoke with this Republican member of Congress and asked him why he co-sponsored a bill that would be so harmful for Texas, right? But obviously coordinating a very civil conversation. And so to your point, I think it was something that, a week later, this member of Congress, not only in the meeting was it very civil, we would had some really good conversations unpacking the realities of our broken and outdated immigration system, but that member actually withdrew his name from that anti-immigrant piece of legislation. And again, so going back to sometimes, these conversations are very painful. It's almost hard. How are you going to sit here and, rationalize with somebody who has a completely opposite viewpoint than you? But there can be some really good work that comes out of, putting the emotional part of it aside and trying to meet that individual where they are to figure out, can we move forward together?
Yeah, great. There are two questions in here about what do you do? And I want to hear from all of you on this because I think we all have a little different strategy on this. What do you do when data and facts just aren't moving somebody? Particularly, there's a little bit of it is, well, I just don't believe you. Some of it is about, fake news or sources that are fundamentally in opposition to you. From my perspective, we love data and facts at the Bush Institute. We try to drive data-driven policy and fact-based solutions, but anecdotes are really powerful. So what from each of you, and let's start with Candy since you're already off mute. What do each of you do when you encounter those people who really just don't want to believe the facts that you're sharing?
Tell stories. So facts aren't going to convince them, in large part because, of course, everyone thinks the facts are false. So we really have worked to tell the stories of our students, and they are heartbreaking stories. A young man whose father died in Mexico. His mother came to the country to try to work so that she could support the family in Mexico. He then came here because his mother had cancer. So he migrated from Mexico to care for his mother while she died, made it through high school, started working, got himself through community college, now is at the University of Washington in Seattle, majoring in computer science, and has an internship with Microsoft. But you cannot hear these stories and not have your heart open up, and particularly the stories about family separation. So stories can really make it real.
Yeah, happy to go. So I think just two quick points. The first, which is, let's not have the first time we're talking to somebody be when we have to try and persuade them about immigration. I think that's the number one way to get around misinformation is like build community with folks, and do that in ways that's not advocacy, not political, but actually just about shared communities and shared identities. That credibility of messenger matters so much more than almost anything you say in these kind of contentious issues. The second, I agree with Candy about the power of stories. I would caution about exemplary immigrant stories can have a backlash effect, unfortunately. And then the other thing is to appreciate that some folks, so empathy is a widely shared value. Most people across the board will say they prioritize justice and fair treatment of people. Many folks, and this is particularly true of people who identify as conservative or Republican, also elevate the importance of security and loyalty to a national identity. And so stories that are only leaning into a story of empathy, again, might not reach as far as stories that also just kind of convey a sense of loyalty to America, loyalty to a work ethic, loyalty to some other sort of more conservative value standpoint.
I'll also add something there. I think that it's really important even to the folks that are with us to ask everyone to use, their critical thinking hat. Question everything that you are being told. Look into the news platforms that are writing stories that you are, quoting in your conversations. One of the things that we think is really important, that I think is really fundamental, is never to make someone feel like they don't understand or they don't know, because that already makes folks cling to their own values, to their own understanding, and it's almost like a battle, right? Like how, who's going to win this debate, and that's not at all how we move forward on this issue. If we really want to provide relief to people, if we really want to help folks. So for me, I always tell colleagues, everyone question, what is the motive behind the source that you are quoting? Where is their funding coming from? What does success mean to the people that you are getting your data and facts from? And so how do you get folks to believe in the facts or the data that you're pushing? I share sources. I say, look up what I'm telling you. If I really encourage you to do your own research. These are the data points that I'm quoting here. And I really encourage you to look at the stuff that I'm telling you, because, don't take what I'm saying as face value. I have a motive here. We all do. Look though at the data point that I'm sharing, and really encouraging folks to feel empowered through their own research really has been a relationship builder for me, because folks come back and say, hey, I looked up that thing you told me about, you were totally right. And that, I think, it provides a lot of comfort to folks to know that they did their own research. I'll just plug in something really quickly, and I'll plug this into the chat. Forward launched I call it a myth busting website. It just sounds a lot cooler, but what it is it dispels some myths around immigration. It's a platform that outlines a couple of the stereotypes or some of the myths that we hear, and underneath it, it'll unpack it with some data. It cites the data source there. And so, for example, the idea that immigrants take American jobs, that's one of them. And then underneath it'll unpack and say, immigrants are actually, highly entrepreneurial, and they actually have shown to create jobs that employ native born Americans, right? Things like that. And so I'll drop that into the chat if folks want to look for a good data source to share.
And I'd add there, one of the things I think and Dan, you probably have seen this before, there's some research that indicates that you shouldn't re-emphasize the myth when you're talking about things. So I try to not, when I am having these conversations, not to say back the myth that was said to me. If someone says, well, immigrants take jobs, I don't say, well, immigrants don't take jobs. I start with immigrants create jobs. And, that is my perspective. That is what I believe that the data backs up, but I make sure to be intentional about saying the positive about it and not restating the negative. So we've got a couple other questions. I'm going to actually, this one, this conversation is more about how we talk about this and how we have these hard conversations, but there's a couple of questions in here about policy, and we're not all probably on exactly the same page on policy, but I'm going to throw one out here just because I think we all have some similar perspective. And I will take the first one with moderator's privilege. We have a question that says, I think crime, border security are completely different issues from immigration. We want secure borders. We want to keep criminals and terrorists out. Rational immigration policy is completely different. I disagree, because in my opinion, you must have robust border security and robust legal immigration policy working hand in hand. One of the reasons that you see illegal immigration or a large undocumented population is like the video said, there's just not a lot of ways for people who want to come here and work to come here legally. So when we think about the motivations for people who want to come to the United States, and we are the #1 destination for migrants worldwide, they're coming for economic opportunity, they're coming for freedom, they're coming for the things that we enjoy here. They're not coming for things like welfare. They're not really entitled to any of the benefits that are in our federal entitlement system. Even legal immigrants can't get them for 5 years. And then you also have to think about why they leave. People aren't leaving because they have a wonderful system set up at home and they have all the opportunity that they can have and they're safe and secure just to come take advantage of us, right? They're leaving because there's a reason, there's a motivation. They know they can make more here and support family back home. They know that there's more freedom and opportunity, or maybe simply the situation is unsafe. We see that a lot when you look at the asylum system and the pressure that's been on our border in the past few years. That's really driven by corruption and insecurity and instability in Central America. So when you think about this topic, those things are so intertwined. You really can't do one without the other. And so from my perspective, I really don't think you can do border security first, because I think it will fail. And in one of my past jobs, we did an analysis of what would it take to just enforce the laws we have now and completely shut down illegal immigration. It would cost us $400 to $600 billion. It would take 20 years. It would reduce our workforce by 6% if you were to deport everybody. And you're talking about $1 trillion in GDP loss. And so when you think about policy, particularly immigration, you have to balance those things. Is it worth it to spend that kind of money and that time to enforce the laws that we have? Or should we look at the laws we have and say, what can we do to change this? And what would be realistic? And how do we meet the moment that we're at? And so I'll open this to the panelists. I mean, I took a very broad view of this, but if there's something you'd like to add in terms of how you view immigration policy, welcome to hear it.
Yeah, I'll take it back to, the intent of this panel conversation, right? There are many offices. So immigration is an issue that needs to be solved at the federal level. That is the only way that we're going to get any sort of immigration reform done that would provide relief to folks. There are a lot of folks that you need to bring along, a lot of members of Congress that you need to bring along because you either need their vote or their support, that refuse to have that conversation without talking about border enforcement. And so I think for the question, does it really, it looks like two very different topics. They're one of the same in terms of how you need to approach a solution because of who we're targeting, who our audience is really. So I'll just kind of add to, I think Laura, you covered it beautifully. So I'll just say in terms of having the conversations though and moving pro-immigration reforms forward, it is also something that gets coupled in regardless of whether we want to talk about it or not. I also do inherently understand the desire to be as safe as possible. And when you sort of are really getting your news from one specific source that is constantly terrorizing you around, people are coming in, criminals are coming in, there is an influx of border. I can understand why folks, because we are a product of what we consume. And so it's really been something that we need to talk about when we're talking as well about providing relief to folks.
Yeah, I would just quickly say that, so if we approach it from a policy lens and look down, then you can isolate, maybe not border security and immigration, I agree with you, Laura, but we can isolate immigration as a distinct domain. The one thing I would say is if we flip our lens and we think what is the individual doing? None of us actually isolate policy that way. We experience policy, whether it's immigration, education, housing, health, everything through so many different lenses. And it's all about who are we as Americans? Who are we as Texans? Who are we as a community? And so that is sometimes helpful to think about how do we best communicate, recognizing that individuals actually don't isolate policy the way that policy language itself does.
Well, and I'll add, one of the things that I find interesting about this topic is, especially post 2016, I would get questions all the time, is this the worst it's ever been in terms of conversations about immigration? And I think if you were to look back at history, you can easily say no. We've demonized in some form or another every single wave of immigrants. There were some horrific things said about past immigrants. You can go all the way back to Ben Franklin, who really just hated Germans so much. He thought that they were never going to be as American as the rest of us. They were never going to speak English. They were swarthy. They didn't fit in. They were going to always be low skilled. And so we've been doing this over and over. I really don't think this moment is particularly different in terms of the conversation. But what really, really changes the way we talk about this is leadership, right? Not just leadership at the national level, leadership in your communities, leadership in your faith communities, leadership in your neighborhood, in your own families. And so even if you fundamentally disagree with the policies I put forth, I hope that each of you, when you leave here today, will really think about how you talk about this and remember that you're talking about people. You're talking about human beings. And so to the extent that we can just remind ourselves that we're talking about human beings and we need to be respectful of their integrity in that way, you'll see this conversation, I think, take a little bit calmer tone and temperature. And we'll get back to really talking about the things that matter and those trade-offs in policy and those little wonky things that, that take the heat out of this conversation. We've got some other questions in here. And for anyone that feels bad, I know there's some comments coming to the chat. I'm not trying to misinterpret your questions. We don't feel bad about any of you. We're just trying to address the things that we think that are at the heart of your questions. This one, and I think we've all met people like this. It says, can you help me understand why the majority of Republicans are pro-immigrant, but for Trump, who did 400 plus executive orders against immigrants? And I'll open this to anyone who wants to have a say at this one. My comment would be people vote on different priorities, and immigration is not always the number one priority. And I think we see that in all the people we talk to.
I will echo that. Even conversations with my own family, and many of my family members did vote for Trump, both the first time and the second time. And in a conversation with my brother, he was very focused on capital gains taxes, saying, if I'm going to be a single issue voter, I would vote for Trump. And my conversation with him and the question I asked back was, yes, I understand that, but what about the soul of our nation? And asking him that question really led to an interesting and deeper conversation. Now, I will tell you, I don't know this for sure, but I'm certain he went ahead and voted for Trump. So I agree. I think it's really they're focused on other issues and can somehow find a way to overlook what they think is not going to be, is not as important to them, I guess.
So in More in Common Studies, we did a poll November 4th through the 6th. We're going back in and we do ask a lot of these questions, but I'll be honest. And I think the best way I can answer this is I don't know. I don't know why I think it's very difficult to understand why people vote. And I could rattle off a lot of data saying that people self-report why they vote, but self-reported data in this kind of question is maybe not the best indicator to guide us. And so understanding motivations for voting, understanding requires a lot of engagement and curiosity. And if we want to bring people around to a viewpoint on immigration that we believe is best for our country, best for our families, best for our communities, I think going in with whether it's humility or whether it's from an advocacy mind, like I need to persuade this person, I want to understand why. I want to understand from their own language, their own viewpoint, why they do this, why they acted that way, and how can I help affect the change that makes us feel, makes both of us feel as if supporting an immigration is actually better for both of us, for our families, and et cetera.
So we have a few minutes left, and one of the things that I think is hard about this is we're at a point in society where and maybe it's always been this way, and I'm just waking up to it. It's very easy to feel like someone else's vote is immoral. And what I try to remind myself when there are people in my life who just fundamentally disagree with me is that I do love this person, and there's a reason that I love this person. And there's a reason that this person remains in my life, even if I disagree with them. So from each of your personal experiences, can you talk a little bit about how you remind yourself of those? Because at the end of the day, I come from a family where politics was a side dish at every Thanksgiving table. We were always very comfortable talking about issues, and my grandfather watched C-SPAN for fun, so that was who we were, and that's kind of who we still are. But at the end of the day, we all left hugging and still really happy we were in each other's company. How do each of you in these tough conversations with friends and family remind yourself, this is a person that you love and respect for a variety of reasons, and that this is not one issue that's going to make or break that relationship?
I'll kind of get it started there. As I mentioned before, I come from a community that has many mixed status families. And as a first generation American myself, I, again, understand this issue very personally. And so one of the things that I've learned is that there are folks in my own personal life who, for example, I have cousins who their parents benefited from 1986 IRCA, who were able to, whose parents were able to adjust their status. And so my cousin grew up not understanding really what the limitations of living undocumented was, or having an undocumented parent, and having the fear as a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 10-year-old that your parent might not be home when you get home from work, from school. And then on the other end, having cousins whose parents were completely undocumented, and then understanding kind of that dynamic of how some folks were just unable. This issue hit home so close that they weren't able to have these conversations with the other side of my family who they had other views, because they didn't have their family's livelihood wasn't on the line with their vote. And so they were voting on other things, as we just, talked about what, inspires some folks who might support immigration but vote otherwise. And I think one of the things that I always try to understand that is the lived experience there. When we're sitting down at the dinner table at a family birthday party, that the two sides of that family have very different lived experiences. And so where are the similarities? Where are the struggles that they can share, and therefore understand why we need immigration reform? And so I think that's kind of where again, going back to knowing your audience, really understanding who you're talking about. I'll throw a really quick anecdote there. In the middle of another anecdote, but here in Texas, as like the leader from Forward in Texas, we had a pretty anti-immigrant session a couple of years ago at our state legislature where we passed a show me your papers, basically anti-immigrant law called SB4. There were a lot of folks in my own personal circles who were like, well, we want to be as safe as possible. Again, going back to like this safety perspective. And at that time, I remember here in Austin, there were a couple of incidents where someone was throwing these large rocks from the upper deck of I-35 onto cars underneath. And some folks were severely injured. And there was a big call out, there were commercials, I remember seeing this, where the Austin Police Department was asking folks, hey, if anybody has any tips, if you've been harmed by this or you've witnessed this, please come forward. We're trying to find this individual because, people are getting hurt. And I knew someone in my personal circle who feared coming forward, who had been a victim of this. While they were driving, somebody threw a rock. Fortunately, they were able to pull over and their car was harmed, but they were physically well. But this person was, I tried to encourage them, call, give them the information, where it was, maybe there were cameras and they can find the person who did that. Like, your information is extremely valuable in solving this and keeping everyone safe. And they were so scared because of their immigration status that they refused, to call in. I then shared that story with my family and said, do you see how that makes all of us less safe? When folks are scared to come forward with information that could keep our community safe because of our broken immigration system, that hurts everyone. And I think I remember that conversation with folks, light bulbs lighting up and thinking, oh yeah, we all want the same thing. We want to be safe, and our immigration system limits our ability to do that.
Katie, do you have anything to share here?
I'll just come back to the comments that I made at the beginning, which is, I think it is best if we not go into conversations trying to convince others to come to our viewpoint, but rather to understand theirs. So if we think about ourselves as investigative journalists and really trying to go deep in understanding what drives someone's fears, their concerns. And Zara, I love that you gave the example when you were talking about, okay, let's talk about what if we did deport all of the immigrants from Texas? What would that look like? And you just keep going deeper and deeper. And in those conversations themselves, I think they might begin to understand, gee, maybe my fear about this, I'm not really able to articulate it well why I have it. Maybe it really isn't that justified. So without you ever having tried to convince them of anything, just simply trying to understand where they're coming from.
I think the only thing that I would add is the importance of cultivating and sustaining ideologically diverse networks. And so I started my career as an Army officer. And so, and I've worked in a number of different kind of advocacy worlds. And so I think I'm very fortunate, and I'm very grateful that at a moment like this, that I have an ideologically diverse network, that when people articulating positions that I disagree very strongly with, I know them. And so I can understand, and we share some sort of identity that matters to me. I mean, the people that I serve with, and I know that there's a huge set of issues and values and beliefs that we are actually in lockstep on. And so the more narrow our circles become, and it's hard. This is incredibly hard at a moment when politics is so much overlaid into morality, right? I mean, our disagreements are in politics are actually not really about policy. More often they are about morality and what side you're on. And that's a very difficult terrain to try and bridge and cultivate networks that cut across the sides. But it's something we have to do, and we have to do more of it. And that way we can cultivate these relationships and have conversations that are completely outside of politics, so that our conversations about politics become much healthier.
Yeah, and I would just add, I want people to feel comfortable bringing uncomfortable topics to me. I want them to know and understand that if they have a question about something that makes them uncomfortable, they're not going to get yelled at. That I'm going to listen and try to understand where they're coming from, because they're more likely to ask me difficult questions if they feel like they're going to not be judged at the outset, if they're going to be heard. And so I think that's just one of the things that we should all strive to be better at, is making sure that we are taking the time to really understand that, you know, these don't have to be conversations that are hard, and we're only going to have good conversations if, as you said, we have maintained these relationships and that we have these broad networks. So thank you, all three of you, so much for being on this panel. Thank you to Center for Houston's Future for inviting me. For all of you who are listening in today, I want to say, please take the things that you heard today and go out and implement them and help grow more of these conversations. You know, that you have the power to be leaders in the community on these issues. And so we hope that you will have nice, productive, fun conversations over the holidays. And now I'm going to turn it back to Brett to close out for us.
Well, I just wanted to thank all of you for just an amazing conversation. I learned so much from each and every one of you. And I think it's really appropriate to have this maybe at the end of the year, having been through what has been a very difficult year with the pandemic, with the political election, to think that we can think about our humanity and think of ourselves as Americans. And even though we come from different places, at the end of the day, it's our diversity that makes us strong, and we have to recognize that and really value that and find ways to talk about it. And so what you guys have done today is think about ways of having this kind of conversation where we can have that kind of diversity, and even though we have come from different points of view, find ways to value that. So thank each of you for being part of that conversation, and thank you for our audience for being part of a very active part, more active than I've seen in any of our conversations through chat. It really worked out well. Laura, you did an amazing job of facilitating it. So hopefully this will not be the last time that we get this group together. Hopefully we'll be able to continue. Thanks very much. Hopefully everybody has a great Thanksgiving and a great holiday season. So thanks for being part of it. See you guys.